Hi, everyone. It's nice to see all of you guys here. I'm delighted to welcome you to Deterrence Disrupted, the impact of emerging technologies on nuclear risk. My name, for those of you that don't know me, is Will Ortell, and I am the founder of USC International Student Young Pugwash and the academic vice president for Delta Phi Epsilon. Today, I'm speaking with Martin Hellman virtually and Robert English live in person about some of the most important issues that currently face our world: nuclear geopolitics and emerging tech. I'm going to do some intros here, so bear with me. Dr. Hellman is Professor Emeritus of Electrical Engineering at Stanford, and with his colleagues Diffie and Merkel, he invented public key cryptography, the technology that secures transactions on the internet, including literally trillions of dollars of financial transactions daily. His work has been recognized by a number of honors and awards, including the single $1 million ACM Turing Award, the top prize in computer science. Dr. Hellman has a deep interest in the ethics of technological development, and his current focus is on rethinking national security, a project that has the support of former Secretary of Defense Leon Panetta, among others. He is well known for his usage of quantitative risk analysis in determining the possibility of deterrence failure. Dr. Hellman is a rock star in the nuclear scholarship world, and we are delighted to have him with us. Everyone, please join me in giving him a warm welcome. On the right here, I have Dr. English, who is an associate professor of international relations, Slavic languages, in literature, and environmental studies at USC. He studies Russia, the former USSR, and Eastern Europe, with a focus ranging from general issues of regional relations to specific questions of ethnicity, identity, and nationalism. He is also an expert on geopolitics broadly and formerly worked as policy and analyst for the U.S. Department of Defense and the Committee for National Security. In addition to teaching, Dr. English has received a lot of fellowships, so everyone bear with me here, from places like the Institute for Advanced Study, the Princeton Society of Fellows, the U.S. Fund for Peace, the International Research and Exchanges Board, and the Ford Foundation, and the National Science Foundation. He is also the advisor for both of the organizations that are collaborating for this event, and he is sort of the heart and soul for us, really the USC expert on deterrence, and basically everyone told me that this wouldn't be a proper conversation if we didn't have him here. So everyone give Robert English a warning. Okay, so as a lot of you guys will have known, nuclear arms control seems to have broken down completely recently. The US abrogated the ABM treaty under Bush, the INF treaty was abandoned under Trump, and recently, Vladimir Putin has declared that Russia may be leaving the New START treaty. Meanwhile, the public is regularly exposed to new kinds of nuclear weapons and new kinds of threats to use them. Today, Putin is threatening tactical nukes. Yesterday, it was Trump threatening to incinerate North Korea. Dr. English, how did we wind up in this situation? How dangerous is it?
Well, we didn't listen to Drs. Hellman and English, that's how. But more specifically, I thought I would answer that introductory question with a quick primer on the basics of recent nuclear history, arms control, and essentially deterrence, right? That which is under siege now. So let's go. This is what I would emphasize. For 50 years, so most of my lifetime, my academic lifetime certainly, right, since the early mid-1970s, we have benefited from a nuclear stability based on deterrence. Nobody would dare launch a nuclear war for fear of suffering devastating nuclear retaliation. Some people call this MAD, mutual assured destruction. We were all deterred, not just from nuclear, but from a conventional attack for fear of retaliation. So nuclear weapons, paradoxically, had no use except to deter others from using them. And the stability of MAD, mutual assured destruction, rested on this central certainty, as well as three other conditions. And this is what's important to understand in the erosion of deterrence. One of those additional conditions was a ban on anti-missile systems, what were called traditionally ABMs, anti-ballistic missiles. This was so because these systems would threaten the adversary's ability to retaliate and so deter on both sides. If one side were to develop an effective anti-missile system, then the other would fear that they might be tempted to attack, thinking they could escape retaliation with that defensive system. In other words, it would serve as a shield behind which the sword might now be tempted to strike. So the ABM Treaty banned nationwide defensive systems, assuring assuring the ability to retaliate and therefore stability. The second condition was a series of agreements to reduce offensive weapons, such as the START Treaty that's just been mentioned, but others as well that all included verification measures, some of them very intrusive, because an uncontrolled arms race in offensive weapons would cause uncertainty, fear, and therefore be destabilizing. And that essential confidence of MAD would be undermined. The third condition, adding to stability, undergirding stability, I should say, was robust early warning, so that nobody had to fear a sudden attack, what we once called a bolt from the blue strike. If we always had something like 25 or 30 minutes of warning, and that's how long roughly it would take an intercontinental ballistic missile to travel between the USSR and the US or other strategic distances. As long as we had that half hour of warning, then we had time to verify that actually we were under attack. It wasn't an accident or a failure of warning. It wasn't a flock of geese or a radar failure. Those things happened. We would also have time to consult with the other side, make sure what was going on, and we would have time to deliberate and then decide, do we want to throw everything back and go global? Or maybe somebody's launched one missile at us and we'll exercise restraint and not escalate. All of that was possible with a half hour or so of warning. And therefore, we could deliberate calmly, think about our response, instead of firing everything off and ending the world. So this framework of arms control agreements, including a ban on missile defenses, of openness and verification, and of robust warning, it was strong at the time of the Cold War's end. And it lasted for at least a decade thereafter. The 90s, at least in this arena, were the safest time perhaps ever. But since the beginning of the 2000s, right, both the US and Russia have backed away from arms control, as Will outlined. And both, along with China, all these great nuclear powers, are developing new weapons, hypersonic missiles, space-based weapons, anti-satellite systems, and good old anti-ballistic missile defenses that together are undermining these pillars of stability that we negotiated so painstakingly in the late 60s, 70s, and of course in the 80s between Reagan and Gorbachev at the Cold War's end. That, in a nutshell, that's a pretty big nut, I'm sorry, is what's gone wrong.
Mm-hmm. And I think we're going to get to a lot of those emerging weapons a little bit later on in the talk. But for now, I just want to stick with Russia and kind of what's going on right now.
Can I add in here a few things?
Absolutely, Dr. Hellman.
So first of all, I want to say how wonderful it is to see young people interested in this issue. We need most of us have beards, white hair, gray hair. I'm actually 77 in spite of my lack of gray hair. So thank you for your interest. Also, I want to say that the way I met Professor English was about a little less than 2 months ago. I read in the National Interest his paper, Rescuing Gorbachev's Legacy, and I wrote him a short email saying, thanking him for it and telling him that I checked it out with an expert on Slavic affairs here at Stanford and who spoke very highly of him. So thank you for that. Next, I'd like to, I do agree with you, Bob. There are a few things I'd like to point out. The Cold War wasn't quite as stable as people think it was. 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis during the Cold War was the closest we ever came to using nuclear weapons. Neither Khrushchev nor Kennedy wanted to teeter on the nuclear abyss, the brink of the nuclear abyss, but they did. Similarly, 1983, even without Able Archer, which some of you may be aware of, Ronald Reagan's first term was one of really scaring the bejesus out of the Soviets. And they were afraid that there was going to be a bolt from the blue. Many of them thought Reagan was crazy enough to start a nuclear war, which of course he wasn't. And the 1990s, which you pointed to as a relatively peaceful era, safe era, and it was, but it helps to point out that the 1993 Russian constitutional crisis, as it's called, which was really a coup. I think a couple hundred people died, and the parliament building was shelled. This was when was that 90? I think it was 93. Yeah. And if you watch a video of that, it's amazing that the world didn't go up, because here you have a country with with over 10,000 nuclear weapons, and there's a civil war going on, much worse than January 6th in this country. So how did we get here? I mean, there are many answers to that, but I'd say most fundamentally, we didn't rethink national security. National security had one set of equations for survival in the before the nuclear era, and another afterward, and we haven't really rethought it. Another answer to that question is that we believe our own BS. My wife, when she was an auditor at what's now Deloitte Touche many years ago, told me that a company's in trouble when management begins to believe its own BS, and a country's in trouble when it begins to believe its own BS. And so the United States has been called the world's sole remaining superpower many times, and we actually believe it. And I think at some level, we believe that we as a nation are Superman, that we can jump off tall buildings and fly. The trouble is, when we tried this in 2003 with Iraq, we climbed up the stairs and jumped off the tall building called Iraq. We crashed to the ground, but we didn't learn our lesson. In 2011, with a different president from a different party in power, we climbed up another tall building, this time on crutches, because we still hadn't fully recovered from 2003. It was called Libya. We jumped off expecting to fly, and instead we crashed to the ground. In both cases, the nations were far worse off for the American military intervention, and America's national security was worse off. So I think that's how we got here. And one other thing I'll point out, that I'll throw it back to Will, is the nuclear threat viewed from a different angle is the nuclear opportunity. Just getting rid of the weapons, which is what most people who work on this issue focus on, would not solve the problem. If miraculously we could get rid of all nuclear weapons tomorrow, but nothing else changed, what would happen? The nations that knew how to build nuclear weapons would try to reconstitute their arsenals as quickly as possible, and whichever nation got there first would be sorely tempted to use its weapons while it enjoyed a temporary monopoly. We actually have to build a much more peaceful world, one in which our foreign relations are based on reality instead of wishful thinking, in which we don't climb up tall buildings expecting to fly when we jump off, things like that. And that is the nuclear opportunity. It's a world that we can be proud to pass on to you and future generations. Okay, that's enough for me for now.
Well, I was just going to jump into that last point a little bit. In building that world, do you think that a more efficient way to do this, and Dr. English, you can jump in on this point as well, a more efficient way to do this is by changing the actual intentions of countries and their outlooks on the world? Or do you think it's through a set of more robust international agreements, like kind of beefing up the IAEA, or so more, I guess, constructivism or more liberalism?
I think it's going to take a fundamental shift in thinking. Einstein put it very well I think it was 1946, right after Hiroshima and Nagasaki. He said, the unleashed power of the atom has changed everything except the way we think, and we thus drift toward unparalleled catastrophe. We need to wake up to the fact that the world behaves differently. We have thousands of nuclear weapons. China has a few hundred. We act as if that makes them a second-rate power, so it's not surprising that they might be building thousands of them, which is a question you might get to later. And so we need to recognize that how many weapons does it take to have a credible deterrent? I would say it takes under 100 probably, but certainly under 1,000. And yet we have roughly 6,000 today in the United States.
Do you have anything to add to that?
I would agree. You can already see how we're dividing the labor here, what the Russians call разделение труда. I gave the kind of more narrow technical answer, and Dr. Hellman gave the larger foundational answer. And I couldn't possibly disagree with what he said about the underlying, what has to change in a fundamental way to achieve the agreements. Yes, I could have said more narrowly, we need an agreement to prevent proliferation of hypersonic missiles. We need an agreement to prevent the militarization of outer space. And of course, to save what's left of arms control and maybe resurrect some of the traditional agreements. But he's absolutely right. There's no way to get there with our current thinking, all of ours, in this country too, and our adversaries, the way we are now. No way possible. We are going headlong away from arms control. I assigned in my class on technology and international relations, some students, I'm not sure they saw it this year, some special, I had them look at a RAND corporation, a really nice explainer, a 10-minute video on hypersonic weapons. It was done about 4 years ago, and it explained very well what hypersonic weapons are, how a scramjet operates, the problems of guidance, control, et cetera, and the fact that the US, the Chinese, and the Russians are all, and not only them, but probably the North Koreans, the Indians, are moving to develop these weapons. And this video ended with a lovely hope for limitations, hope for some measures to prevent proliferation and halt this headlong rush into the sphere. 5 years later, 4 years later, we're practically at war with Russia. We are at severe loggerheads with China, and no one is working towards any of these kinds of arms control seriously, because the tensions in the world and these traditional attitudes have not changed.
Yeah. I just want to add to that. I just attended a seminar this afternoon at Stanford that was done by Sig Hecker, the former director at Los Alamos National Laboratories, the weapons lab. And Sig has been to North Korea 7 times, I think, all in the first decade of this century. And he makes the point very convincingly that the actions of the United States almost guaranteed that North Korea would develop nuclear weapons. Now, there are people who differ with him, but I agree with his position that, for example, the United States' position on diplomacy has been that it's got to be about denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, which sounds great until you deconstruct it and realize what that means is unilateral nuclear disarmament on North Korea's part, because all of North Korea's nuclear weapons are on the Korean Peninsula. We have none. So imagine North Korea came to us and said, hey, we'd like to negotiate, but it's got to be about America's unilateral nuclear disarmament. There's no way we talk to them. And so we need to really think things through and come up with, stop thinking that we're Superman and can jump off tall buildings and fly. We need to recognize what's realistic. The most reasonable critique of Sig Hecker's position that I read about a month ago by Galinsky made the point that to do diplomacy with North Korea, to continue what was known as the 1994 agreed framework, which prevented them from building a nuclear weapon, in my conviction. In fact, they did not do their first nuclear test until 4 years after George W. Bush killed that agreement in 2002. But Galinsky argues that to go ahead with the agreed framework, we would have had to overlook North Korea's unwillingness to have the IAEA inspect 2 sites where they were probably cheating. Well, okay, we cheat, they cheat. I mean, this is how the world works right now. We've got to change that. And I'm not saying we're comparable to North Korea, mind you, but we need to recognize that if they're not going to admit that they cheated, is it better to let them, to not push them on that and not have them get nuclear weapons, or is it better to push them on that and have them get nuclear weapons, which is what happened? And sometimes you've got 2 choices which are not ideal.
And is it fair to say that with a few regional differences, the exact same scenario could be playing out in Iran right now?
Yes, and to some extent in Ukraine. Now, this is a tricky one because Putin invaded Ukraine, and that is not justifiable. But I will point to one undeniable fact. The University of Chicago did a poll in Ukraine last June under the sponsorship of the Wall Street Journal, but the Wall Street Journal did not report on this because they didn't like the results, I suspect. But I spoke to one of the lead researchers there to confirm the authenticity of the poll. because not surprisingly, it found that 85% of the Ukrainians polled blame Russia for the war. But surprisingly to most Americans, 70% also blame their own government and 58% blame the United States. Now, those numbers don't add up to 100%, which tells you that there's plenty of blame to go around. Putin is most responsible for the war, but we also took actions. And I will point to Mike McFall, who I know Professor English has heard of, but the students may not. He was the Obama's ambassador to Moscow and a colleague of mine here at Stanford. And now Mike has no love lost between him and Putin right now. Mike is on the Russian sanctions list. He can't go to Russia. Any assets he has there would be confiscated. He hates the Russians and they hate him right now, or Putin at least. But in 2001, I found an article by Mike in which he said, "The time has never been better to renew our relationship with Russia and with Putin." This was right after September 11th. And what he said was Putin has gone the extra mile by encouraging the Central Asian republics that used to be part of the Soviet Union to allow American military transport planes to land to replenish our troops in Afghanistan. And Putin was doing this against the advice of his generals. And that's why Mike was saying the time has never been better. He then prescribed some things that we should do, which we did not do, including and truly ending the Cold War was his term. And as one example of that he gave was repeal of the Jackson-Vanik Amendment, which the students probably never heard of. It was passed in 1976. It punished Russia, or the Soviet Union in those days, for not allowing free immigration of Soviet Jewry. Now, by 2001, when Mike published that paper and Jackson-Vanik was still on the books, I think it was 4 million former Jews from the former Soviet Union lived in Israel and the United States. So Jackson-Vanik made no sense, and many of the Jewish groups that tried to get it on the books were in favor of repealing it. I found out about 10 years ago, 15 years ago, one of the key reasons it was still on the books. There's a Hasidic sect, an ultra-Orthodox Jewish sect called Chabad that's based in Brooklyn. And there are enough of them that they have a lot of pull with their congressman. And they put pressure on their congressman not to repeal Jackson-Vanik until their Rebbe's library was moved from Moscow to Brooklyn. Needless to say, the Russian segment of Chabad did not want the Rebbe's library moved from Russia to the United States. But it's just an example of how crazy things are.
Yeah. I wanted to pick up on a point that both of you guys kind of alluded to. This is not on the script either, but I think it's relevant. Essentially, you said, Dr. Hellman, that the United States has many more missiles and nuclear warheads than they would need to have a compelling deterrent. But it seems to me that the United States wants to deter to a point, but they also haven't pulled back their first strike possibility. So, for instance, China refuses to take a first strike, and they've been very clear that their nuclear policy is solely as a deterrent, is the reason that they have their missiles. But the United States, as part of their nuclear plan, does have deter, but down the line, their goal is to win a nuclear war. It is not necessarily to have mutually assured destruction, because they don't believe that the destruction would be mutual. What are your guys' responses to that? And that's obviously, I've never worked on the national security.
Okay.
So.
And it's really, I'm really glad you brought that up, Will, because for 9 years, I've been aware that the role of America's nuclear weapons is not only to deter, but also, if need be, to win a nuclear war. And recently, I came across an article that said it again. And so I went back to the Obama, Trump, and Biden's nuclear posture reviews, and I read through them. I actually searched them on the computer. And the last two, Trump's and Biden's, both say, but Obama's does not, that the role of American nuclear weapons is to deter and, if need be, to win a nuclear war. If need be, to win. How can you win a nuclear war? This is counter to what Biden has said. It's counter to what Ronald Reagan said. They both said, and Reagan was the first one to say it, a nuclear war cannot be won, must never be fought. And yet the nuclear priesthood, the elements within the Pentagon that write these nuclear posture reviews and that have a lot of influence on them, included that in it. And STRATCOM, the successor to the Strategic Air Command, apparently has winning a nuclear war if deterrence should fail within its mission statement. I've never been able to find it online, but 9 years ago, when the Stratcom commander was here at Stanford giving a talk, he was introduced, and the person introducing him said, the mission of Stratcom is to deter aggression and, if need be, to defeat any aggressor, even in a nuclear war. I was shocked. And so I'm trying to get Congress to write wording into the next National Defense Authorization Act, assuming that Biden still believes what he said in the campaign on the campaign trail, because otherwise they won't go against him, that would prohibit the use of any funds appropriated under the NDAA for trying to win a nuclear war, because that creates a very dangerous situation if you think you can win one.
Yeah. I guess I would just add, again, with our same division of labor, you just heard the policy, almost the philosophical side of this equation. And let me just speak to the technological side. And I guess I'm being a little repetitive, but scholars like Press and Lieber at Dartmouth, others writing about US nuclear primacy, the way our arsenal and our developing capabilities look to others, have made it pretty clear, have argued convincingly and at a highly technological level that whether we're trying to or not, whether some of this defense acquisition, some of these programs have to do with politics in different districts, have to do with nuclear labs or defense contractors in lobbying, the sum total is a panoply of capabilities that would frighten any adversary into thinking we are building a nuclear arsenal that can win a war and that maybe could even launch a first strike and prevail. I even had a student presentation today, because we just coincide in our topics with this panel, on something called left of launch. Left of launch, this is hard to explain, except it's actually easy to imagine. Military planners like to sketch out a timeline, D-Day, right? D-Day -10, -5, the landing craft moved into position, -3, the command prepares this, -2, they arm the soldiers, -1, and then they go. That's D-Day. And then +1, 2. So it moves horizontally with a series of stages and preparations. So in the military way of thinking, launch is D-Day. When our enemy might think of launching a weapon at us. Well, we've been struggling and wasting trillions on national missile defense, ballistic missile defense systems for the last 20 years, even more. And it still doesn't work worth a damn. And inevitably, our planners have come with this idea. It's so hard to shoot down individual warheads. It's so hard even to hit a booster before the bus separates. Wouldn't it be better if we could hit the missile on the ground? Then we could take it out, one shot, and we get all the warheads. And maybe even before it launches, we even have a better chance. That's what they call left of launch, right? You're going back in time. But what does that mean? That means preempting. That means striking, launching a war, attacking the other guy before he attacks you. And maybe he wasn't even preparing to attack you, right? Saddam Hussein had no WMD. How many times in history has the pretext of, this was self-defense, we were just preempting, turned out to be a lie? So we are inching towards a policy with some in the Air Force, right? Some in the Space Force or those commands that were mentioned, towards a policy explicitly, it's not hidden, it's not classified, of left of launch, i.e. preemptive or even preventive capabilities. Guys, this is the most destabilizing thing you could do. How does it look to China or Russia or North Korea? America is reserving itself the right to strike first. And they're going to go after our arsenal. That's our only defense, to deter them. And they're going to take it out, even, out of the blue on a bright, clear day when nothing's happening. Well, if they're going to do that, what do? We move to launch on warning. We get 5 minutes, 3 minutes, 30 seconds of warning. We're going to be on a hair trigger posture and we'll launch. Otherwise, we lose them. Use them or lose them. We'll have no deterrent. So why are we moving towards launch, this left of launch, this preemptive nuclear policy? I don't know what combination of looking for more bang for the buck, a more effective way to eliminate the enemy's arsenal, how much believes it's actually right and doesn't care that it frightens the others. and how much is ignorance, or how much is that it's in your congressional district, Senator, right? So you're going to favor that program. You know how American defense budgets are drawn up. Some combination of that ignorance, stupidity, but we are moving towards a primacy in nuclear weapons and even a first strike capability. And what are the other side doing? You know, and I'll stop with this one more observation. Going back to 2001, when George W. Bush administration decided to withdraw from the ABM Treaty. Remember, the ABM Treaty is a pillar of stability. We won't build defenses, neither will you. We'll both be vulnerable, and then everyone is secure because nobody will launch first. You start building, you throw away the ABM Treaty, start building defenses. In 2001, the nuclear experts warned, probably Dr. Hellman, certainly the entire arms control community in the US, Michael Crapon, right? Anyone you can think of said, don't do this. It'll drive the Russians, it'll drive the Chinese to build up their offensive capabilities. We are now exactly 22 years after that. And what do we see? The Chinese are deploying hypersonic weapons to evade our defenses. Russia has them too. Russia is developing crazy subsea Poseidon, doomsday weapons, a kind of unmanned underwater gigantic torpedo nuclear bomb, so that whatever happens on land, they can still retaliate. We are so much more at peril with all of this. It was foreseen. Why did we do it? Again, some combination of stupidity and maybe, and I'll stop with this, back to Dr. Hellman's original point, it comes back to arrogance. It comes back to thinking we can evade the laws of gravity. In this case, the laws of elementary strategy. We jumped off that skyscraper and it's about to hit us in the face.
It sounds to me that the two of you are alluding to a gap in what kind of researchers and academics are saying about the nuclear issue versus what actually gets put into government policy. Why do you think that gap exists? And are there any structural, institutional things that people could do, people in our position, people in Congress, whoever, to try to make it so that the experts' advice is being listened to at the highest levels?
I think the fundamental question is whether you believe that war is inevitable or not. I think the people who are planning this left of launch and things like that are trying to figure out ways they might be able to win a nuclear war, which is why it's so important to really focus on the question, is it possible to do that? Because if we differ on that assumption, if person A over here thinks that you can win a nuclear war and I think you can't, he's going to want very different strategies from me. And my wife and I wrote a book. I got involved in these issues originally. I'm known, as you pointed out, Will, for much better for my work in cryptography and information security than in this area. And what got me to shift wasn't wanting to save the world; it was wanting to save my marriage. 40 years ago, we were on the verge of divorce. We'd been married, 16 years, I guess, because we've been married 56 years now. My wife fortunately decided not to leave me, and she went looking for solutions. And the good news is not only did we save our marriage, but we haven't had a fight in almost 20 years. And we still talk to each other, by the way, and we still disagree with one another. And this was beyond my wildest comprehension, and I give her full credit for that vision. But Dorothy, my wife, puts it this way. She says, the on-ramp to the new map, which is what we call this new way of thinking, the on-ramp to the new map is believing that it's possible. If you don't believe that it's possible to have a relationship like that, a marriage like that, if you don't believe that it's possible to have a world where nations get along, then you're going to seek left of launch, etc., hoping that maybe against all odds you can succeed. And by the way, if anybody wants to download a copy of the book, if you go to my Stanford website, which you can do by Googling Stanford and Hellman, we've made a PDF of the book freely available. You can download the entire book for free. And while most of you are not married, you still have friends, you have roommates. It applies everywhere. And the same fundamental issues apply interpersonally and internationally. We summarize it as get curious, not furious. When Dorothy, my wife, used to do things that seemed crazy to me, I used to treat her like she was crazy, which drove her crazy, which convinced me I was right that she was crazy. We do the same thing internationally. We treat Russia, North Korea as if they're crazy, and at times they are, but so are we. And that drives them crazy. And it convinces us we're right that they're crazy.
Anything to add to that?
As usual, I'm in the shadow because my observations are minute and trivial in comparison. But I think at least one's worth adding, and that is I am struck. I cut my teeth in the 70s. I worked for Paul Warnke. The book on this subject I remember reading was Strobe Talbot's Endgame, which was the story of SALT II. That really hooked me, sort of intelligent journalism. I read Newhouse Cold Dawn on the SALT I Treaty. I worked at the Arms Control Association for a while. And at that time, when the Reagan administration came in, SALT II Treaty died, Star Wars, big military buildup, and Professor Hellman was absolutely right. The first Reagan term was very perilous. There was a core of really expert journalists and sort of think tank analysts who knew what was what, who didn't take this crap for granted, who didn't swallow the pablum, who challenged administration assumptions, who challenged, I remember the days of Richard Pearl, prevail in denying this idea of winning a nuclear war. They called it prevailing. And all these assumptions that Star Wars would do this, that the Soviets were doing that, therefore we had to respond. And you had people like William Broad, and you had Fred Kaplan, and you had so many first class. These were journalists expert in nuclear affairs, like they had PhDs. And I somehow assumed that knowledge, I was trained by these people. Here I am 30 years later, and as the new arms race is emerging, I'm not only in despair at what's happening, but I look around at our major media. I look at the New York Times, the Washington Post. I don't see that expertise. I see it's as if they've gone down 3 grades, 5 grades in school, and they swallow whatever the administration says. They're easily fooled. Their stories are full of mistakes or false assumptions. It's just shoddy. And there simply isn't that automatic challenge. You might still see it, on tax policy. Mm-hmm. And by the way, that means that we also don't have people in the Senate, the old hands of the Senate, who knew what was what and worked with those journalists. And it made the discourse challenging, competitive, serious in a way that it's flimsy and superficial now. I see, I'm not saying that I have a program, unless you guys all study national security and then go into specialized journalism there. That would really help. But right now we lack it. And that's part of it too. It's not the main part. The main part, again, is this fundamental, attitudinal thing. But on the margins, our discourse is cheapened by lack of expertise and just nonsense.
Mm-hmm. If I may, I would just say...
I just want to say amen. Thank you for saying that, Professor English.
I would just say, if not all of us want to go into national security and then journalism, maybe a potential way that we as consumers could improve the discourse is by being maybe a little more selective with what we consume and kind of changing the incentive structures around how the top news outlets make their money. If there's more of a demand for quality information that's well thought out and less kind of aggressive partisanship, potentially that could be helpful.
And to think like an historian, my wife jokes that I'm doing a second PhD in history under Bart Bernstein's direction. I don't know if you know him, Bob. Do you know Bart?
Just by reputation.
He's an amazing guy. He is one of the world's, if not the world's premier historian of the nuclear age, in my opinion. And he's also a stickler for getting things right. And when new information comes out that contradicts something he wrote before, instead of hiding it the way many people do, he'll trumpet it. He'll say, hey, I thought this before because we didn't know this, but now we know this. And that's what we need to do. We need to be willing to admit our mistakes as individuals and as nations. And that's so key here. And so I subscribe to a number of alternative news media, which I don't swallow them whole. I get Johnson's Russia list that you may be familiar with, and you can tell people how to get that. It's free. He does ask for a $50 donation, but if you're a student, I am sure he will not be upset if you don't pay it. And it's a fire hose of 20, 30 articles a day when David's not on vacation. And a lot of stuff is from TASS and RT, the old Russia Today. And when I see something there, I never use it, but then I search and I see if I can find it in The Guardian or one of the more liberal British newspapers, and very often I can, and especially when they have direct quotes, which makes it easy to find online, they're almost always right, because they will not, I don't think they'll publish things that people could just say are obviously wrong. And I've learned a lot of amazing things that way. And so how do I know what to accept? There's a concept in law called declaration against interest. Okay. If I say in a court of law, if you ask me, is that your signature on that contract? And you're the lawyer for the other side trying to get me to pay the money that your client says is due him from me. And I say, yes, that's my signature. That's a declaration against interest. It's a declaration in interest if I say, but he didn't fulfill on the contract. But so do you see why you can accept the first statement? And the second one may or may not be true, but then you have to look at that. And there are some declarations against interest. For example, Mike McFaul's writing in 2001 that the time has never been better to renew our relationship with Russia and Putin. That's a declaration against his current interest. So I tend to accept that more than I would something else. So I think learning, what do we know? This is something Bart constantly impresses on me. What do you know, and how are you sure that you know it?
Okay, we've gotten through about 3 of our 11 questions that I had today, but I want to ask one really quick before we open it up to audience kind of input, because we don't have that much time left. So missile defense systems have Chinese officials have publicly called space the, quote, common explorative property of humankind, and attempted to instill a blanket halt on the advancement of military space technologies. Are they genuine in their concerns to preserve space as a grounds for scientific exploration, or are they simply worried about a U.S. advantage in the new potential military arena, keeping in mind that the U.S. is by far the most advanced on a lot of these technologies? What are some considerations in military space technology that we should keep in mind for deterrence over the next 5 to 10 years? And maybe throw a little AI in there, because, we were, I guess that would be another question, but how would artificial intelligence potentially impact our nuclear systems as well?
There's a lot there. Let me start first and reverse the order.
Please. Go ahead.
2008, when China and then subsequently China and Russia together proposed, and I can't give you the exact vehicle and format, but they basically proposed that we agree, come to a treaty, all kinds of provisions to halt the militarization of space, to limit the military uses of space. The US wasn't interested. The first thing I'd say is, well, we'll never know for sure unless we try them on it, right? At that time, though, I will add, China had not tested the kinds of anti-satellite weapons that they have recently. China had not developed and tested high-powered ground-based lasers and experimented with blinding or painting satellites in orbit. They certainly had not. There were still another 150 launchers, smaller in their nuclear arsenal. I don't know. I said 2008, 2009, so it was over a decade. I can't give you all the particulars, but I think they were probably sincere, and it wouldn't have hurt to try. And at a minimum, to see what kind of strictures could have been negotiated. Would there be problems with verification? What absolutely new kinds of verification would it have required? Because this wouldn't be the same as a treaty on traditional ICBMs or INF. But we didn't try. And I think it was telling that when, I guess it was 2018, 2017, the US formally announced the formation of the Space Force, which I hate, because now at baseball games, when the color guard comes out, there's Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, and these idiots who are really just more Air Force, and they don't even have any banner. I hate that. It's upset the balance for a lot of other reasons too. But when we created that Space Force, I remember like it was yesterday, a speech by Vice President Pence. He went to the Pentagon and made this big announcement. And he said openly, our goal is dominance. Of course, the other side is going to get busy. I mean, we didn't say we're going to be peaceful. We didn't say we're not any threat to you. We don't want to negotiate a treaty, but go ahead. We're not going to threaten you. He said, we're going to threaten you. We're going to deploy military. We are going to make sure we can hold your satellites at risk and you can't ours. We're going to investigate space to Earth, kinetic or directed energy weapons. We said all that openly. What do you expect? That was lunacy to me. Again, as somebody who was raised in the Cold War with the understanding that nuclear stability, and détente required accepting parity, accepting mutual deterrence. Maybe our American attitudes it's never sat easily with us that we would be deterred by someone else, that those dirty commies or those lousy Chinese could hold us at risk the same way we do them. Maybe there's just something in our arrogant nature, our politics. I don't know what, but as someone who was raised on the strategic side, it was necessary to accept parity. And we have announced from the get-go in space that we're going to dominate. So no matter what was serious in 2008, 10 different ways we made sure it didn't happen. And we made sure an arms race would gallop ahead. Will we stay ahead? Will we be proven right because we can actually establish and maintain dominance? I doubt it, but this is technologically quite a ways out of my expertise.
Wait, sorry, just to be clear, you're saying that there was an opportunity for negotiation of seizing technological advancement back in the day, but at this point we've sort of crossed the threshold and now the arms race is on.
Something like that. I mean, actually, it was already on from the time of Star Wars, but we put it back a little bit into laboratory in the 90s because of all the arms reductions. I can't say exactly what a treaty might have looked like, but it certainly would have been better than no restrictions whatsoever. And I think Dr. Hellman kind of alluded to that. You could have a treaty with an adversary who chisels at the margins, who isn't quite honest, but if the overall effect is to make both sides safer, and they're not really getting ahead, they're just kind of chiselly partners, that's still better. Mm-hmm. So would China have chiseled? Would Russia have concealed something? Would it have been, the Senate would have gone crazy because they always do, but it might have been much better for everyone concerned. Us first, again, just rely on our self-interest. We don't have to care about them, although I do. But even if you don't, it's in our self-interest that we not accelerate into this militarization of space. I'm very worried about that.
I see what you're saying. Dr. Hellman, do you have anything brief to add to that?
Yes, I'll be brief. First of all, in terms of your question, was China genuine or trying to gain an advantage? The answer is both. Country, whenever somebody talks about a country as if it's a monolith, that's a mistake. The United States is not a monolith. You've got John Bolton and you've got me. We're very different people. And so some of the Chinese were, I think, genuine, and some of them were trying to gain advantage. Coming back to your question about artificial intelligence, it all depends on the assumptions. If you assume that war is inevitable, if you assume that you can possibly win a nuclear war, then the artificial intelligence or the human intelligence is going to produce really very different policies from if you accept the other assumption. And so we really need to dig down and see where our assumptions differ. And we still may differ, but at least we'll know why we differ rather than arguing way out in the decision tree. And I'll stop there because I know you want to get to the audience for questions.
All right. Does anyone have any initial questions? Adam?
So something that Dr. Hellman touched on with the Superman example, and you, Dr. English, also touched on a lot, was this kind of American exceptionalism and how much it's contributed to the issue. So I was wondering if you had any inkling on how we as a nation can kind of deconstruct our ego and move away from it.
No.
I do. We have to think about what is American exceptionalism. My grandparents came to this country 110, 120 years ago from Eastern Europe. I'm Jewish. They spoke differently. They didn't speak English very well. They looked different. They were discriminated against. And yet here I am, a professor at one of the world's top universities and almost universally accepted. And I'm an American citizen. So this is the American exceptionalism. That could happen in other countries too, but it's much more likely to happen here. I've got friends. I was just talking to a friend from India who's a Muslim today. She's now an American citizen, as is her husband. Her daughter was born here. This is what makes America great. We need to think about what it is that's American exceptionalism. We need to move away from Madeleine Albright's prescription when she was Secretary of State that said America stands taller than other nations and we can see further. So if we need to use force, it's because we have to. I mean, that kind of hubris, that kind of arrogance is just ridiculous. That's not American exceptionalism.
So kind of going off that question, I know there was an episode today with Fox with the Secretary of the Army talking about a decrease in enrollment. And so a lot of that was about how Americans kind of have a different view from a lot of our military in terms of American exceptionalism especially. And so then the way it was really framed was the like military doesn't really need to change its actions, but rather we need to change how it's being presented to like the American public. So now talking about like the Space Force, if you go to the Space Force and you watch like the recruitment videos or anything, it's very much like we are going to beat our enemies, and like they repeat the word enemy quite a few times about like different world like countries. So does this issue really need to be approached as like changing the minds of Americans or changing the approach of us? Where is this balance that we need to meet? Because to me, it just sounded very like we just need to change the narrative, but we don't need to change our actions from what like top military officials are saying.
Well, I think if we change our perspective, we will change our actions. It's the actions emanate from the perceptions, how we see things. If we see a country as an enemy, we're going to behave very differently from if we see them as a potential partner. I know certainly when I saw my wife as the enemy, I behaved very differently toward her in disagreements than I do now.
Nothing to add.
Nothing to add, Nicole?
Just going off on the space tangent for a little bit. I know you spoke about how you're against the Space Force and kind of taking our geopolitical issues to space and the militarization of space. But I was curious what you guys think about hypothetically going to space and space colonization as a human race, not divided by countries, but the exploration, maybe space tourism or the colonization of space in the near future. What do you guys think about that? Is that in our self-interest? Are there ethical issues we need to consider?
I can't speak to technological challenges, expense, how long it would take, and how difficult a road would be. But the idea of a joint endeavor that would involve all nations is great. I'm not against the Space Force per se. We have a lot of activities in space that are legitimate, and some have a defensive, cautionary nature. We can't just put all our guard down. It's a bad world out there, and whether we help contribute to this cycle of distrust, it's there. I just want to make clear that charging ahead and constantly leading the arms race is what I'm against, and where I think we should talk internationally. And a joint project, that would be amazing. I remember that brief moment of the peak of détente in '75, Apollo-Soyuz, a joint US Soviet mission. And I remember the early days of the International Space Station. So obviously it's not a guarantee. Those examples deteriorated, right? So a joint mission like this is not a guarantee that our frictions on Earth won't overcome us in the heavens. But given the disaster of climate change, given the need, given that space exploration, let's say, before I say colonization, could unlock sources of resources, energy, and so much else that would be in everyone's benefit. Maybe that is the joint mission for humanity in the future. I just don't know well enough, but I like the idea a lot.
I would agree that working together, I just want to add that working together is key. And whether if we would, missile defense would not be a bad thing if we worked on it cooperatively with the Russians and the Chinese, which was Ronald Reagan's original idea. And if you go back, if you go to my opinions page, which is accessible from my Stanford homepage, I've got one there. Will the real Star Wars please stand up? Written about 1985, mid 80s. And I said that basically, if we develop Star Wars, Ronald Reagan recognized that developing Star Wars for unilateral advantage didn't make sense, and so he promised to share it with the Soviets. The trouble was that the American military said we wouldn't share it with them until after we knew it worked. Well, are we expecting them to be that naive that we won't share it, that's top secret while we're developing it, but then we'll share it with them later? And so I said, well, the real Star Wars, please stand up. Is it an old mode attempt at unilateral advantage? In which case, let's admit it so the American people can judge it on that basis. Or is it a new mode attempt at helping all nations? And in the same way, climate change, I'm glad you mentioned that one, because that's something that has a lot of mind share right now. And one thing that I've said repeatedly is that the real problem is not nuclear weapons. It's not climate change. It's not artificial intelligence. Those are really symptoms of the deeper underlying problem, which is that technology has given human beings godlike physical power. In the Bible, for example, only God was supposed to be able to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah with thunderbolts. We call them nuclear weapons. Only God was supposed to be able to create a flood that would necessitate Noah building an ark. Climate change threatens the same thing today. Only God was supposed to be able to create new life forms, yet we do it routinely in the laboratory. So the real problem is not any of those things, genetic engineering or climate change or nuclear weapons. Those are symptoms of the deeper underlying problem, which is that our physical power through technology is godlike in nature, and our maturity level as a species is at best irresponsible adolescent. We're drinking and driving, basically. And so we'll never be godlike in our maturity level, but we can at least aspire to be mature adults who think further than quarter to quarter. And if we solve climate change and we come to take it seriously, if we come to take nuclear weapons seriously and see that the real problem is we're not thinking like mature adults, hopefully we'll extend that to the other problems. They're all really the same.
Yeah, just a quick question. In this hypothetical nuclear war, if there was one, what do you think is the most likely trigger events? I've read that there's going to be maybe a lack of resources, such as clean water or food or overpopulation in one country. Or do you think it's more likely to be the actions of particularly powerful individuals like Putin?
The likeliest trigger, if there were to be a nuclear war, how would it break out? I think by accident. I think, and I could really go into detail in specific scenarios that would take a long time. Let me just put it this way. As we build up more, and we're both, by the way, launching major nuclear modernizations, and the ceilings that keep us around 7,000 with the Russians, as New START goes away, who knows? The Chinese are building up rapidly, others are. Proliferation is underway. So we'll have more nuclear weapons inevitably, and will be more and more hair trigger because of hypersonic, because of these defenses, because of what we're putting in space. So there are just so many ways, it's almost like mathematical that if you could calculate, even in any given situation, the risk of accident leading to war is small. With this proliferation and all the instability, we're making it inevitable sometime in the next 20, 30 years. That doesn't mean it'll be global nuclear war, right? But there will be, okay, one more example. It is inevitable that in one or another country, because of the fear of a first strike, brought on by hypersonic weapons, brought on by partial defenses, brought on by all that we've seen happening, that the command authorities will devolve launch control from the nation's capital, from the elected leader down to top military commanders who might then even go further. And that adds to the likelihood if 40 different people who are authorized now to judge the urgency of a situation and press that button could do it instead of just one who sits a little more removed. Again, put all that together and it's going to be an accident in my estimation, an overreaction to a false warning, aggravated by an underlying tense confrontation over I don't know what.
I'm going to take a slightly different perspective. I think that to answer your question, today with the war raging in Ukraine, the most likely source of a nuclear war is the Ukrainian war escalating out of control. And in general, I think over time, the Cuban Missile Crisis shows that conventional conflicts escalating out of control are the most likely source of a nuclear war. And so 2 years ago, I published a paper with Vint Cerf, who some of you may have heard of. He's one of the two true fathers of the internet, which is on my publications page, in which I estimated that the risk of a major nuclear war, not just a limited one, was about 1% a year. That corresponds to playing Russian roulette with the whole world about once every 15 years, 5 times over the lifetime of a child born today. 3-4 times over your expected remaining lifetimes, the students in the audience. And Bill Perry, the former Secretary of Defense, who has a PhD in mathematics, told me a couple of months later that he agreed with my estimate. And I asked him if I could quote him on that, and he said, yes, I can. Now, that was before the war in Ukraine. This was 2 years ago. With the war in Ukraine, clearly there's an elevated risk, and I currently think that we are pulling the trigger in that global version of Russian roulette about once every year that the war continues. Now, those who say that a nuclear war is unlikely are right, because what are the odds of surviving Russian roulette? 5 chances out of 6, you're most likely to survive Russian roulette. But even one pull of the trigger is too many, and especially pulling it repeatedly. So I would say we need to really go backward and not just get rid of the weapons, because as I said, that's not going to happen in the current environment, and it wouldn't really solve the problem. We need to think about why we keep getting into needless wars, and all of them have been needless, including, in my conviction, Ukraine, although that one people will argue with me on. I mean, again, Putin is most responsible right now, but we are not innocent there either, as the 58% figure shows from that poll that the University of Chicago did. And so we need to back up and think how we can avoid getting into needless wars and how we can have a better foreign policy. And part of the answer there is to have what Dorothy and I call in our book, we have too few carrots, too many sticks. Deterrence is a stick. If you do something we don't like, we're going to nuke you. What's the positive side? What's the carrot? It's diplomacy. People call diplomacy appeasement. And I won't go into detail here, but you can read in our book why appeasement gets a bad reputation based on one data point that it probably does not deserve, Munich 1938.
Okay, so we are technically over time. So just really quick, I want to give everybody a round of applause. I will say that I know I have some more questions, and I know there were people in the audience that had some more questions. So I'm not sure if you guys have time to stay for, say, 10 minutes over, which would be about fitting in.
I can do that.
Okay.
Likewise.
But
That's what I'm doing class all the time. You're gonna pay me back.
yeah, so if anybody wants to leave right now, feel free to leave Zoom, leave in person. We are no longer going to get offended since it's over. Yeah. But yeah, for anybody else that has questions, feel free to stay. Yeah, go for it. And also, Bibi, has anyone asked any questions online?
Yeah, there's someone that's trying to ask one, which hasn't actually accepted yet.
Okay, you go first then.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I wanted to thank you, Dr. English and Dr. Hellman, for being kind of a voice of reason. I follow the foreign policy community and the discourse very closely because I'm going into a career, but it's crazy to see how there's a wave of militant, foreign policy branch that is developing and really growing in DC, especially right now. And it's good to see that there's voice of reason. My question was more specific about the war in Ukraine, and there have been speculations about, whether or not the chain of command in Russia will hold if there is an order from the top to use nuclear weapons, whether those are more limited scale attack in Ukraine or any other kind of nuclear escalation. I would like to hear your perspective on whether you think that the chain of command will hold if, let's say, Putin orders a nuclear strike.
If you're asking, would they carry it out, his officers? I would say probably, very, very probably. That doesn't mean there isn't dissent. It doesn't mean that society and the military too aren't under enormous strain, but Putin obviously has a machine with controls, with incentives and disincentives. He can punish. He has his carrots and sticks, and there's been turnover. People have been replaced. He has a loyal and obedient circle around him. It doesn't mean that there couldn't be some hidden mole who will, not refuse to carry out the order, but I wouldn't bet against it at all.
And even if there's a 10% probability that he carries out the order, and I think it's a lot larger than that, that's too much. And so I would actually back up and say we need to try to figure out which of our current actions are likely to precipitate Putin ordering the use of nuclear weapons. And if Ukraine tries to take back Crimea and especially Sevastopol, which is the Russian Black Sea port, which is their San Diego, that's one of the few things I think that could really precipitate with almost certainty the use of nuclear weapons. I don't think that Russia would put up with that. And not just Putin. By the way, Putin is one of the more moderate people in Russia. This is a mistake that many Americans get from our media. If he's replaced in regime change, it's quite likely to be somebody who is more hawkish than even him.
This is a fitting thing to talk about. The many people, for good ethical, moral reasons, will say it's not right that the brave Ukrainians, that we should restrain them, that we shouldn't give them every weapon they ask for and then some. It's not right that we're not helping them to achieve total victory because of Putin threatening nuclear war. It's not right that someone can do brutal things because they have nuclear weapons. I'm sorry, that's the way the world is. It also wasn't right that we told Muammar Gaddafi that if you give up your nuclear program, we will readmit you and you'll be in good favor. And then we killed him. And something similar with Saddam Hussein. People we knew were brutal authoritarian leaders, but we sort of had an agreement, and they followed through and they suffered for it. What lesson did we teach Kim Jong-un in North Korea? Right? He was watching, and others who would be proliferators, who will try even harder now, because that's the only way you can be sure that Uncle Sam won't change his mind one day, and instead of trading with you, will then sanction you and then invade you. You know, I know it's not quite that simple, but to them, that's a very clear lesson.
No, actually, North Korea put out a press release after Gaddafi, after we attacked Libya, saying this proves that we were right to develop our nuclear weapons.
So what I just mean is, whether it was the US and USSR, you can imagine the same people furious that somehow Putin, foul old Putin with his nuclear weapons, should restrain us from helping the Ukrainians win a total victory. Well, they probably thought, how awful that we have to cooperate with those nasty commies in Moscow. Mm-hmm. I mean, what have they not learned over the last 50 years? This is what nuclear weapons do. Maybe if we really didn't like that, we shouldn't have allowed and facilitated so much proliferation.
But one of the things I say in my report on Rethinking National Security, which you can download from my publications page or the Rethinking National Security part of my website, is that the time to treat a nation with respect is before it has nuclear weapons rather than after. And we often don't treat even nations with nuclear weapons with much respect, as you're pointing out. So we need to find a way to guarantee Ukraine's security and Russia's security. And there are ways to do that, but not when we think in the old mode where there's one side wins and the other side loses. The zero-sum game does not work. If we think in terms of zero-sum game, we're all going to end up dead.
And that compromise was there in 2021, 2022, and that's what 58% of Ukrainians are saying, that right. They didn't need to join NATO, that they would have compromised and given Russia the security guarantees Putin was demanding, and maybe they would have avoided this war. In hindsight, now, of course, it's all changed. People are furious, they're livid, they're patriotic, it's all understandable, but 58% when the war started said, dang, Zelensky, why didn't we,
In fact, when they voted for Zelensky, they thought they were voting for a peace candidate. He ran on a peace platform, but there were threats against his life. The right sector, which is a neo-Nazi group in Ukraine, threatened to lynch him if he followed through on his campaign promises to negotiate with Putin. And they have killed people, so that's not a hollow threat.
One more observation about how we think and debate about the possibility of nuclear use by Putin, by Russia, or anyone in this current conflict. I went to hear, and so did some in this room, I think. I know at least Edward did. We went to hear Garry Kasparov at UCLA giving the Daniel Pearl Memorial Lecture about a month ago. And Kasparov was great, but it was a kind of standard, anti-Putin speech. But it was very inspiring and in the spirit of Daniel Pearl, the murdered journalist. But he said at one point, when asked about Putin, that Putin's insane. He's just drunk with power and Russian national dreams, and he's taking his country to ruin, and he's irrational, and nobody can figure out what's in his mind, and he just has to be stopped. Later, the question was asked, would he use nuclear weapons? Don't we have to be careful in how hard we push and how rapidly? He said, no. Putin will never use nuclear weapons. I'm absolutely sure. He's rational. And even people who are otherwise very favorably disposed, everyone noticed the glaring contradiction. Once again, our emotions are running away with our reason, are trampling our reason.
Mm-hmm. To quote Mrs. Hellman, we have to get curious, not furious.
Amen.
Okay, was there a question from online?
There's a question from Zoom from Nikita that asks, to what extent can we expect militarization to increase long term, and how can we expect this to change the nature of international politics toward or away from other social and technological issues?
Well, I would say that we are actually becoming less militarized in many ways. I haven't been able to get the data recently, but both The Better Angels of Our Nature and another book, Winning the War on War, that came out about 10, 15 years ago, pointed out that the number of battle deaths during the Cold War was about 200,000 a year. In the 90s, the first decade when the Cold War ended, it was about 100,000 a year, half. And in the aughts, the first decade of this century, it was about 50,000 a year. The Syrian civil war pushed it up, and Ukraine is unquestionably pushed it up. So the big question is this a step backward, or is this just a temporary move backward? I'm hoping that we're moving forward because we've eliminated something like 90 to 95% of the nuclear weapons in the world. At the peak of the arms race, there were 70,000. Today, there are only, quote, only 13,000. I mean, that's still far too many. But we are evolving. Dueling, which used to be thought of as a part of human nature, slavery was a part of human nature, and war is still thought of as a part of human nature. But I believe, and I have no choice but to believe, that we can change our thinking there yet again and find that human nature can change, and human nature is to change.
I want to add on to that really quick that I'm not sure about the other book that you mentioned, but I know that Pinker's Better Angels of Our Nature has, like, some of the statistical tests in there have come under a lot of scrutiny. So
yeah, I don't agree with everything Pinker says, but by and large, we are becoming more civilized, more human. Even if you don't agree with the stuff, the statistics in the book, look at 200 years ago, if you talked about slavery, people would have said, you can't change human nature. Slavery's been with us since the beginning of civilization. And yet slavery today is a non-issue. It doesn't mean that slavery is gone. We still have human slavery in this country and around the world, but we're much better off with it not being legalized. Women getting the vote. My wife's grandmother was born when women couldn't vote. And today that's just ridiculous that women can't vote. And gay rights are something that 50 years ago I would have said, what's that? I'm sorry to admit it, but I would have. Whereas today it's part of our culture, and we are advancing, and I'm hoping we'll continue to advance, but we need to speed it up.
Do you have anything to add to that?
I agree completely.
What role, if any, do you think the military industrial complex has when it comes to like contributing to the arms race we see today?
A huge role, a big role. You know the story, the warning of President Eisenhower as he was leaving office, that the military industrial complex, a term he coined, was perverting our national budget, our national priorities, and for its own, financial purposes, twisting, consuming all these resources and participating in threat inflation and, a kind of highly militarized foreign policy. We've gone through waves, peace dividends, and the defense budget has slowed down and then sped up, but it's still enormous. I mean, it's approaching $1 trillion a year. Maybe it's already at $1 trillion a year, I think. I don't know, maybe it's because of the materials I choose to use in class and that I read, but sometimes my best illustrations of a new weapon system or how this might work is taken from some video prepared by Northrop Grumman or Lockheed Rockwell or some other to show some future drone system or some future stealth aircraft. I use those partly to illustrate where technology can be taking us, but the lesson escapes nobody that this is propaganda, right? That's going to every congressional district, that's working its way into Top Gun movie or our popular culture. The military-industrial complex has learned as well as any big tobacco, pharma, whatever, this industry or that, how to get their way, how to persuade. And of course, the military-industrial financial complex, right? This sort of genius of a major new weapon system will always have subcontracts and subcontracts for jobs in construction in every one of the 50 states. Anything bigger than a Jeep, if it doesn't have at least 49 pieces in different states of the union, and that makes it impossible to kill. So yes, we still live with a powerful military industrial complex, and it's just gorging right now.
Okay, I think Professor English said it all, so I'll pass and go to the next question because we need to end soon.
Okay, I think I might close off with a final question here. And it was one that I had meant to ask during the technology section, but we wanted to open it up, so I didn't get a chance. Artificial intelligence has been all over the news recently with the introduction of several chatbots by major tech corporations like OpenAI, Baidu, Microsoft, and certain people have even claimed that theirs possesses a degree of sentience. How should we forecast the introduction of artificial intelligence into nuclear weapons and defense systems and other military technologies? Do you think that, or how could you forecast the long-term impact of systems that largely respond to non-human agents?
If the human agents that design them are thinking the way we think now, they're not going to help. They're going to make it worse. If we'll change our thinking, then we'll change the AI.
I'm out of my league. And I hope that's.
I guess I'll just push back a little bit on that. Do you think it's possible that, or plausible that we could develop an artificial intelligence system that might not be fully aligned with the intentions of the humans that developed it?
There is a risk of that, and some of the people that are know more about AI than I do are concerned about things like that. But I don't. It's not the issue that I work on because it's not my specific area. Plus, it's going to be a very hard one. I already got one hard problem that I'm working on.
All right.
Are you saying that if we hand the keys to government to AI and our adversaries do likewise, then it'll be more militaristic than we are, or maybe smarter and less militaristic than we currently are?
I think that it's an open question. I mean, I'm not in a better position to forecast right now than either of you are, but I think that there is a certain risk that we develop an agent that isn't necessarily aligned with human intentions and may not see the dropping of, say, a tactical nuclear weapon with the same degree of kind of taboo and revulsion than the average person would. But I'm not sure. I think that's a pretty good place to wrap up. So please, another huge round of applause for each of you.
Well, thank you for organizing this, and thank you all for coming.
Thank you.